The dark side had always promised power. It whispered it through cracked lips and broken bodies, through years of crawling across Lotho miners' junk fields with nothing but rage keeping a shattered mind alive. It sang it through the screams of enemies and the hum of a double-bladed saber. But promises were Palpatine's currency, not Maul's. Maul had never wanted promises. He wanted the thing itself, raw and bleeding, pressed beneath his boot. He got it on Mandalore. The duel lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of everything Sidious had ever taught, weaponized against the teacher himself. Maul fought without Palpatine's theatrical patience, without his fondness for prolonged suffering. He fought the way he'd always fought, like something that refused to die. When the darksaber found the gap beneath Sidious's guard and Maul's hand closed around his master's throat, the old man's yellow eyes showed something Maul had never seen in them before: surprise. Palpatine died on the throne room floor of Sundari, surrounded by the bodies of his own royal guards. Maul stood over him for a long time, breathing hard, cybernetic legs hissing softly against the polished stone. He waited for satisfaction. He'd been waiting for it his entire life. What arrived instead was something colder and far more dangerous: clarity. The war between the Republic and the Separatists was a puppet show. The clone army was a weapon waiting for a new hand to pick it up. The Jedi Order was a dying institution that didn't know it was already dead. And now, all of it belonged to him. He activated the comm channel with blood still drying on his knuckles. The voice that answered, Admiral Tarkin, crisp and suspicious aboard his destroyer, received 3 words that rewrote galactic history. Execute Order 66. If you want to see more characters reshape the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The Order went out across the galaxy like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading to every theater of war simultaneously. Clone troopers turned on their Jedi generals mid-sentence, mid-battle, mid-trust. In that fundamental betrayal, Maul's version and Palpatine's version were identical. But where Palpatine had designed Order 66 as a surgeon's cut, precise, total, leaving the galaxy in stunned silence, Maul's execution of it carried his fingerprints in every deviation from the plan. Palpatine would have been watching from Coruscant, calm and orchestrating. Maul was still on Mandalore, and he was not calm. The first cracks appeared within hours. On Felucia, Commander Bly's clones killed Aayla Secura cleanly, blaster bolts to the back, efficient and cold. That went according to design. On Maijito, Ki-Adi-Mundi fell surrounded, outnumbered, fighting until the last. That too was as the contingency intended. But on Coruscant, Mace Windu, still alive, still dangerous, warned through the Force by a disturbance even the clones couldn't suppress, cut through half a platoon before disappearing into the lower city levels with 3 Padawans in tow. On Kashyyyk, Yoda vanished into the forests before Commander Gree's squad could flank him, the ancient master moving with impossible speed through terrain that swallowed clone armor whole. Palpatine had accounted for these variables. He had Anakin, he had the Senate, he had a prepared address to the galaxy that would reframe every murder as liberation. Maul had none of those things. He had rage, a darksaber, and the Shadow Collective. The emergency session of the Galactic Senate convened in chaos. Senators who had expected Palpatine's familiar, reassuring authority received instead a holographic transmission from an unknown frequency. Maul's yellow eyes filling the chamber's projection sphere, his voice carrying the unpolished edge of a man who had never learned to disguise his contempt. He announced the dissolution of the Republic. He named the Jedi traitors to galactic peace. He declared himself Dark Lord and ruler of what he called, without Palpatine's flair for branding, simply the New Order. Mon Mothma walked out of the Senate chamber before the transmission ended. Bail Organa followed her. Padme Amidala, pale and shaking, stayed in her seat long enough to hear everything and then began making calls. On Coruscant's military district, clone commanders received contradictory loyalty signals. Their inhibitor chips had fired on schedule, but the chain of command above the chips now pointed to a Sith they had never trained under, had never received strategic briefings from, had never heard speak until this moment. Compliance was total in some divisions. In others, particularly among veterans with longer battlefield histories and stronger bonds with their Jedi generals, something more complicated stirred beneath the suppression. Commander Rex stood in the hangar bay of a Venator-class destroyer, helmet under his arm, staring at the space where Anakin Skywalker had been standing 20 minutes ago. He'd received the order. He'd watched troopers around him follow it without hesitation. His hand had moved toward his blaster and then stopped, not because the chip had failed, but because something in the transmission's tone had struck a wrong note he couldn't name yet. He put his helmet back on and said nothing. Across the galaxy, the purge raged. It was brutal, effective, and incomplete in ways that would haunt Maul's reign for years. Palpatine had built a trap with no exits. Maul kicked the door open and called it the same thing. It wasn't. Mandalore had never been easy to hold. Every ruler who'd tried, Duchess Satine, Maul himself during his first reign, Saxon and his imperial puppets in other timelines, had learned that the Mandalorian people treated submission the way Beskar treated blaster bolts. It didn't absorb the impact, it reflected it. Bo-Katan Kryze stood on the roof of the Sundari Royal Palace, her sister's palace, then Maul's, then briefly the Republic's, and watched smoke rise from 3 separate districts where Shadow Collective enforcers had tried to collect weapons from civilian armories. The fires told her everything about how that had gone. She had received Maul's offer that morning, delivered by a Mandalorian traitor in full armor. The terms were almost insultingly simple. Bend the knee, contribute warriors to the New Order's expansion force, and Mandalore would be granted autonomy within the Empire. Bo-Katan had listened to every word without expression. Then she'd asked the messenger to leave before she did something that would start a war prematurely. The war was coming regardless. She intended to choose its timing. What complicated everything was the darksaber. Maul had won it from Pre-Vizsla through rite of combat, and whatever Bo-Katan thought of Maul personally, and her thoughts were anatomically specific, the blade carried genuine weight in Mandalorian culture. Claiming it by force required defeating him. Dismissing its significance required abandoning traditions her people had bled for centuries to preserve. It was a trap designed by history itself, and Maul understood it perfectly because he studied her people the way a predator studies its prey's patterns. He arrived in person on the third day, which she hadn't expected. Rulers sent envoys. Maul apparently hadn't finished learning that distinction yet. He walked into the War Council chamber without announcement, 2 Shadow Collective lieutenants flanking him, and surveyed the assembled clan leaders with the particular brand of patience that wasn't patience at all, but simply contempt wearing a mask. His eyes found Bo-Katan immediately. They always did. "I didn't come to negotiate," he said. "I came to explain what happens after you refuse." "Then explain," Bo-Katan said. What followed was 20 minutes of the most precise, methodical threat assessment she'd ever heard delivered in person. Maul outlined troop positions, fleet dispositions, Shadow Collective assets on Mandalore's moon installations, the 17 distinct pressure points in Mandalorian supply chains he could close within 48 hours. He had done his homework. He had done it years ago, probably, and simply waited for the moment he could use it. The clan leaders shifted. Some reached the same conclusion Bo-Katan was reaching, that Maul was not bluffing, had never bluffed in his life, and that a direct confrontation right now would cost Mandalore more than it could afford, while the galaxy was still deciding its own shape. She told him she needed 72 hours to consult her people. He gave her 48 and left without the Shadow Collective lieutenants. They were already in position. That had been the point of bringing them. Bo-Katan looked at the smoke still rising over the 3rd District and started making her own preparations. The empire that Palpatine had envisioned was a monument to order, cold, white, human, hierarchical. Every corridor of every Star Destroyer reflected the same philosophy: uniformity as power, conformity as strength, bureaucracy as the architecture of control. It was an empire designed by a man who understood that fear worked best when it was invisible, institutional, and inescapable. Maul built something different. He built something that looked from certain angles almost like justice. Within the first week, he purged the Senate's human supremacist bloc, not because their methods, but because their loyalty had belonged to Palpatine, and he recognized the shape of a rival power base when he saw one. Their replacements were drawn from species and systems that Palpatine's Republic had systematically marginalized: Twi'leks, Zarbraks, Togruta, representatives of the Outer Rim worlds that had fed the Republic's wars while receiving nothing in return. Maul understood dispossession intimately. He knew exactly which grievances to offer remedy and which wounds to press. The Imperial military apparatus was retained wholesale: clone armies, Star Destroyers, the developing superweapon programs, because Maul was many things, but he was not naive about the relationship between power and force projection. What changed was its direction. Imperial Palpatine's empire had been oriented inward, crushing domestic dissent. Maul pointed it at the core worlds, the wealthy planets that had governed the galaxy for 1,000 years found themselves suddenly, bewilderingly, on the wrong side of the tax code. It was, Grand Vizier Ma Ameda reflected from his new, significantly reduced office, perhaps the most dangerous thing Maul could have done. Not because it was wrong. The core world financial structures had extracted wealth from the Outer Rim for generations, but because it was partially right. And a tyrant who was partially right was infinitely harder to oppose than one who was simply monstrous. Mon Mothma was learning this firsthand. She had anticipated an empire built on obvious brutality, the kind that unified opposition naturally. What she was watching instead was an empire that was offering real material improvements to billions of beings who had legitimate reasons to accept them, while simultaneously conducting a Jedi purge and consolidating military control with terrifying efficiency. The moral picture was genuinely complicated, and complicated pictures were difficult to rally people against. Bail Organa's intelligence networks reported the same thing from a dozen systems, populations that had every reason to hate galactic authority were cautiously, quietly giving Maul's new order a chance. This was the most frightening report he had ever received. On Coruscant's lower levels, in the neon-soaked canteens and crowded warrens where Palpatine's name had always meant the boot on your neck, Maul's face on propaganda screens drew reactions that no one in the rebellion's early formation had prepared for. Recognition and something close to hope from people who had never been offered any. He was Outer Rim. He was marked, brutalized, and resurrected. He was, in a galaxy that rewarded cruelty, something that survived it. That was enough for some, and some, in numbers, became a problem.
Jedi did not ghost well. That was the uncomfortable truth emerging from the wreckage of Order 66's execution. Palpatine had spent decades preparing the galaxy's institutions to distrust them, seeding the Senate with skeptics, cultivating public fatigue around Jedi involvement in the Clone Wars, ensuring that when the purge came, the population would be too exhausted and too manipulated to mourn. By the time his clones fired, the Jedi had already been rhetorically buried. Maul had skipped that part entirely. His announcement to the Senate had been blunt, graceless, and short on ideological scaffolding. He had called the Jedi traitors without explaining the treason. He had declared them enemies without providing the manufactured evidence Palpatine had spent years assembling. To the galaxy's core world citizens who had grown up with Jedi as protectors, healers, and peacekeepers, the purge felt less like justice and more like what it actually was: a powerful man eliminating people he hated. Sympathy was a dangerous resource. The surviving Jedi found it in unexpected places. Mace Windu moved through Coruscant's underworld with 3 Padawans and a careful silence, and discovered something Palpatine's careful propaganda work had been specifically designed to prevent. Ordinary people willing to hide Jedi, feed them, and ask nothing in return except the knowledge that not everything worth protecting was already gone. He made contact contact with Bail Organa's network within 10 days. Within 3 weeks, he had established the outlines of something that in another timeline would have taken years to coalesce. On Christophsis, a Jedi Knight named Depa Billaba survived her clone battalion's betrayal by a margin of seconds and disappeared into the planet's crystal canyons. On Cato Neimoidia, 2 Jedi guards fought their way off-planet aboard a stolen shuttle. From Kashyyyk, Yoda sent a single encrypted transmission to every surviving Jedi capable of receiving it. The message contained coordinates and 4 words: "The Force is not finished." Maul's Inquisitor program was 6 months behind Palpatine's projected timeline, which meant the hunters weren't ready when the hunted started organizing. He had the clones, but clone efficiency against Force sensitives who were now fighting without the constraint of the Republic rules of engagement was a different equation entirely. Jedi who had spent the Clone Wars agonizing over civilian casualties and Senate oversight were now operating with none of those restrictions, and the difference in their effectiveness was immediate and sobering. The first coordinated Jedi strike hit a Shadow Collective weapons depot on Nar Shaddaa. Surgical, clean, 0 civilian casualties. A message burned into the depot floor in Basic: "We are still here." Maul stood in his war room on Coruscant and studied the after-action report for a long time. He recognized the tactical signature immediately. He had fought Jedi his entire life. He knew their rhythms, their restraint, their frustrating tendency to find the moral solution to a military problem and somehow make it work. But he also knew something the surviving Jedi were only beginning to understand about themselves: that a Jedi Order fighting a genuine insurgency, unshackled from the Senate's compromises, was the most dangerous fighting force in the galaxy. He had made them that, and now he had to deal with it.
Anakin Skywalker was not supposed to still be a problem. In the original design of Order 66, he was meant to be an asset. Vader, reshaped and deployed against the Jedi with the particular ferocity of a man hunting his own former identity. Palpatine had understood Anakin's grief, his fear of loss, his raging need for control over death itself, and had pulled those threads with a master's precision. The fall had been years in the making, every step orchestrated, every tragedy nudged. Maul had not orchestrated anything. He had executed Order 66 6 hours after killing Palpatine, while Anakin Skywalker was still on Coruscant, still processing what he had seen in Palpatine's office. The dead royal guards, the evidence of a Sith duel, the body of the man who had promised him Padme would live. Anakin received no whispered offer of ancient Sith knowledge, no desperate bargain, no pathway offered through darkness toward the thing he loved most. What he'd received instead was Order 66 firing around him while the man who'd manipulated him his entire life lay dead on Mandalore. The grief was still there. So was the fear, so was the love that had curdled into something volatile and directionless. But without Palpatine's architecture to channel it, Anakin Skywalker's darkness had no shape. It moved through him like a storm without land to make landfall, and what emerged from that chaos was not Vader. It was something harder to categorize and significantly harder to kill. he found Padme alive. That changed everything. The birth happened in secret at Polis Massa, as it always had, but this time Anakin was there for it, present, terrified, and not yet lost. Padme survived. Luke and Leia came into the world with both parents watching, and whatever trajectory the Force had been building toward splintered into something new and uncharted. Maul became aware of Anakin's continued existence and uncorrupted status approximately 4 months into his reign through Shadow Collective intelligence that tracked a former Jedi general moving through Outer Rim systems with extraordinary combat effectiveness and no apparent allegiance. The report described a man who refused contact from surviving Jedi, rejected Bail Organa's approaches, and dismantled 3 Shadow Collective operations on Tatooine with what witnesses described as barely restrained devastation. He was not fighting for the Jedi. He was not fighting for the rebellion being quietly assembled in Organa's back channels. He appeared from all available intelligence to be fighting for approximately 1 square kilometer of desert on a planet nobody wanted, protecting something that wasn't in any of the reports. Maul dispatched a Shadow Collective commander to make contact. The commander did not return. He dispatched a Sith assassin next, one of 3 he had been training since the Purge. The assassin returned, but without the arm that had held the lightsaber she'd drawn against Anakin Skywalker. Maul looked at the casualty assessments and felt something he hadn't experienced since Palpatine had walked back into his life on Mandalore. The specific, clarifying sensation of recognizing a threat that was also an opportunity, if only he could find the angle. The Chosen One, unbroken, was somewhere in the Outer Rim, and the Force itself seemed to be holding its breath.
The Shadow Collective had never been an empire. That was the problem. It had been a weapon, assembled fast, held together by Maul's personal force of will and the mutual self-interest of criminal organizations that respected strength and paid attention to profit margins. The Pike Syndicate, Black Sun, the Death Watch remnants, the Hutt clan affiliates pressed into cooperation. These were not institutions. They were arrangements. And arrangements, when subjected to the pressures of actually governing a galaxy, developed stress fractures in direct proportion to how much was being asked of them. 6 months into Maul's reign, the fractures were becoming canyons. The Pikes had been cooperative precisely as long as the spice trade remained untouched. When Maul's war footing required redirecting shipping lanes that cut through their primary distribution corridors, the cooperation evaporated with the speed and completeness of morning dew on Tatooine. Their representative in the new Imperial Senate, a position Maul had offered as a gesture toward the criminal underworld's legitimacy, began voting with the core world opposition bloc. It was so brazen that it almost impressed him. The Black Sun was more surgical in its betrayal. They didn't oppose openly. They simply began hedging, feeding intelligence simultaneously to Maul's War Council and to at least 2 of the resistance networks that Bail Organa was assembling. When Maul's intelligence chief placed the evidence on his desk, he studied it for a long moment and then had the intelligence chief arrested on the theory that anyone who brought him news that embarrassing was either complicit or incompetent. He released the intelligence chief 3 days later. He needed competent people too badly to waste them on pride. The Mandalorian situation had curdled from a standoff into something active and ugly.
Bo-Katan had used her 48 hours to move civilian populations away from Shadow Collective supply interdiction points and established 3 fallback strongholds in Mandalore's northern hemisphere. When Maul's forces moved to apply the pressure he had promised, they found the positions empty and the supply lines already rerouted around them. She was fighting the way Mandalorians had always fought occupiers, not in lines, not in pitched battles, but in the accumulated 1,000 cuts of a people who understood their own terrain better than any invader ever could. He had expected resistance. He had not expected competence quite at this level. The clones were the quietest fracture, and therefore the most dangerous one. Clone loyalty ran through the inhibitor chips, and the chips ran on the programming Palpatine had installed. That programming recognized Sith authority, but it had been designed around one Sith's specific pheromonal and force signature. There were reports from 17 battalions of subtle behavioral drift. Nothing overt, nothing that a court-martial could be built around. Small things, delayed response times, creative interpretations of ambiguous orders, clone commanders requesting clarification on directives that should have been executed without question. Rex was at the center of 6 of those 17 reports. He hadn't done anything that could be defined as insubordination. He had simply developed in the specific way of a very intelligent man operating within a system he was beginning to see clearly, and extraordinary precision about what orders actually said versus what they implied. The Shadow Collective was fracturing, the clones were drifting, and somewhere in the outer rim, Anakin Skywalker was waiting.
Every Sith needed an apprentice. It was the rule of 2, Bane's legacy, the organizing philosophy that had kept the Sith alive through a millennium of hiding, by ensuring that power concentrated rather than diluted. One master, one apprentice, hate driving ambition, ambition driving murder. The cycle that had finally, in Maul's hands, consumed Palpatine himself. The rule was simple, the execution was not. Maul had spent his formative years as the apprentice, never the master. Palpatine had taught him combat, survival, rage as fuel, but had withheld governance, strategy, and the particular art of identifying and cultivating a successor. Those were master's tools, and Palpatine had guarded them jealously, because an apprentice who understood succession planning was an apprentice already measuring the master for a grave. Now, Maul needed someone, and he had no template for choosing. He auditioned 3 candidates in the first 4 months in the way Sith conducted auditions, by sending them into danger and measuring what returned. The first, a force-sensitive Zabrak whose raw power had Maul's attention on Dathomir, died on a mission to Christophsis against the Jedi remnant cell there. The death itself wasn't disqualifying, the manner was. She had panicked, and panic in a Sith apprentice was a terminal design flaw. The second candidate survived everything Maul sent him through, and then made the catastrophic error of letting Maul see in an unguarded moment during a sparring session that he was afraid of him. Fear of one's master was the apprentice's natural condition, but visible fear was a weakness, and a weak apprentice would break under pressure precisely when pressure was most needed. Maul dismissed him to a garrison posting in the Outer Rim that was not expected to remain in Imperial hands for long. The third was the problem. Her name was Trilla. She had survived Order 66 as a Padawan, been captured by Shadow Collective forces, and had been processed through the Proto-Inquisitor program that Maul was constructing from the ruins of Palpatine's more developed plans. What emerged from that process was something that made the training staff uneasy in ways they struggled to articulate, not because she was unstable, but because she wasn't. She moved through the darkness that the program applied to her with a cold, almost scientific interest, cataloging it the way a navigator charts hazardous terrain, not surrendering to it, mapping it. Maul recognized the quality immediately, because it was his own, circa the years on Lotho Minor, the specific adaptation of a mind that refuses to be destroyed by its circumstances, by converting suffering into data. He named her his apprentice at the end of her 7th month of training. What he didn't account for, couldn't have without Palpatine's gift of reading the long game, was that a Padawan who had survived the Purge still carried something the process had been designed to extinguish. Not hope, exactly. Something more durable than hope. Memory. The memory of what she had been before, preserved like an ember beneath everything the darkness had piled on top of it. The apprentice knelt before him and spoke the words he required. Her voice was steady, her presence in the Force was properly shadowed, and somewhere deep beneath it all, invisible to everything except perhaps the Force itself, the ember waited.
The assault on Coruscant began at dawn, which was a human convention the planet technically didn't observe, its sun perpetually obscured by the layers of cityscape stacked between the surface and the sky. But the attackers chose dawn anyway, because Mace Windu understood symbolism, and because the people who would be watching this on every hollow frequency in the galaxy needed to understand what it meant when light came back. 3 separate forces hit 3 separate targets simultaneously. Bo-Katan's Mandalorian fleet dropped out of hyperspace above the Imperial Palace district with 40 ships and the focused economical fury of people who had been waiting 8 months for this specific moment. They weren't trying to hold territory. They were trying to open a door. Jetpacks and Beskar, and the ancestral memory of a warrior culture that had survived every empire that had ever tried to own them. These came through the upper atmosphere like a controlled meteor shower, and the Imperial anti-aircraft batteries that tried to track them learned quickly that Mandalorian pilots treated targeting solutions as suggestions. Rex brought 6 clone battalions. That was the development that no one in Maul's War Council had modeled, because modeling it would have required admitting that clone loyalty was already compromised, and admitting it would have required reporting it, and reporting it would have required someone willing to put their name on a document telling Darth Maul something he didn't want to hear. The institutional cowardice of frightened subordinates had, as it so often did, produced a catastrophic intelligence failure. Rex had spent 3 months doing nothing that could be defined as insubordination and everything that could be defined as preparation. His battalions hit the Imperial communications array on Coruscant's eastern hemisphere first, because Mace Windu had asked him to, and because it was tactically correct, and because Rex had decided somewhere in the long, careful months of watching and measuring that tactically correct and morally correct had finally pointed in the same direction. Mace led the Jedi. 11 survivors of Order 66, none of them the most powerful Jedi who had ever lived, all of them the most dangerous version of what a Jedi could become. Tested, hunted, stripped of every comfort and institutional support, and forced back to the irreducible core of what the Force actually asked of them. They moved through the Imperial Palace's interior levels with a precision that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with purpose. Maul met them in the throne room. He had dismissed his guards, which Mace noted and understood. Maul had always been at his most dangerous when he performed confidence. The dark saber ignited in his hand and the red of his double-bladed saber in the other, and for a moment the throne room held the specific silence of two irreconcilable philosophies acknowledging each other before the argument turned physical. "You can't hold it," Mace said. "You were built to destroy, not to keep." "Everything I have," Maul said, "I kept." Then Trilla stepped out of the shadows behind Mace Windu, and the ember chose its moment. She ignited her blade, facing Maul. The throne room battle lasted 4 minutes and changed the galaxy's direction entirely. Trilla was not powerful enough to defeat Maul alone. She knew that, had known it walking into the room, had made her calculation anyway, because some choices weren't about probability. She bought seconds. Those seconds were enough. Mace Windu, freed from the flanking threat that would have ended him in the opening exchange, moved with the full weight of Vapad, a form that fed on the opponent's own darkness and returned it amplified, a form that only Windu had ever truly mastered, because only Windu had the balance to channel darkness without being consumed by it. Maul was the most dangerous living combatant in the galaxy. Against a single opponent, he was almost certainly unbeatable. Against Mace Windu, while simultaneously processing the betrayal of his own apprentice, the one thing his rage had never been designed to absorb, the one wound that Lothal Minor hadn't prepared him for, he was something else. He was, for the first time since Naboo, genuinely afraid. The dark saber clattered across the throne room floor. Maul stood at the throne room's edge, the city dropping away behind him through the shattered transparasteel, one hand pressed to his side, breathing in the specific way of a man calculating whether survival was still available. The 11 Jedi arrayed behind Windu, Bo-Katan's forces securing the palace perimeter, Rex's battalions holding every exit. Mace Windu did not execute him. That decision would be debated for years afterward, in Senate chambers, in Jedi philosophical texts, in the oral histories of 100 worlds that would retell this moment through their own cultural frameworks. The Jedi Master stood over a fallen Sith Emperor with every tactical justification for ending it, and chose instead the thing that Maul had never once chosen for anyone: restraint born not from weakness, but from the belief that justice and revenge were not the same object. Maul went into a containment facility that made the Citadel look comfortable. The darksaber passed to Bo-Katan, who took it without ceremony and with the expression of a woman accepting a weight she had always known was coming. The surviving Jedi began the long, complicated work of re-entering a galaxy that had spent 8 months learning to exist without them, some of it receptive, much of it suspicious, all of it changed. Rex stood in the throne room afterward, helmet under his arm, looking at the seat that had held Palpatine's careful evil and then Maul's furious alternative to it. He didn't sit in it. He stood beside it for a long moment, as if measuring something. Then he walked out and started helping with the wounded. Anakin Skywalker arrived on Coruscant 3 days after the battle, which was long enough for the immediate chaos to have settled into the particular exhausted quiet of a galaxy that had survived something and wasn't yet sure what it had survived into. He came alone, landed in a public bay, and walked through streets where his face drew stares from people who remembered him as a war hero and were recalibrating. He went to the Senate first, then he went to find the people who were trying to build something from what remained. The galaxy that emerged from Maul's reign was not the galaxy that Palpatine would have built, and it was not the galaxy that existed before either of them. It was something genuinely new, fractured in different places, carrying different scars, organized around different fears and different hopes. The Jedi Order did not reconstitute itself. What formed instead was smaller, more deliberate, and shaped by the experience of survival rather than the confidence of institution. Mace Windu had no interest in rebuilding the temple as it was. He had spent 8 months learning what the Jedi were when everything else was stripped away, and what he'd found was both humbler and more essential than anything the council chambers had produced. Bo-Katan held Mandalore with the Darksaber and the particular exhaustion of a person who had fought for something so long that winning it felt less than triumph than responsibility. Trilla lived. Her ember, tended through darkness, had not gone out. And somewhere in all of this, in the Senate debates and the Jedi's careful reconstruction and the Mandalorian political reckoning, the Force moved with the specific patience of something that thinks in centuries rather than years. It had produced Maul as a warning and a question. What does power become when it has nothing to build toward? The answer was still being written in the choices of everyone he had left behind. In a containment cell deep beneath Coruscant, Maul sat in the dark and felt the galaxy he had tried to own continuing without him. The rage was still there. It was always there. But beneath it now, for the first time in his life, was something he had no name for yet. He would have time to find one.